Welcome to the presentation for the Open Education Resources Transition Plan for Bluebonnet Learning Instructional Materials. This presentation is part of the House Bill 1605 webinar series. This presentation will cover the following topics: House Bill 1605 highlights, the transition plan overview, the transition plan template, and a review of the action items outlined in the transition plan. If after viewing this webinar you have questions, please submit those questions to our Instructional Materials Implementation Help Desk. The goals of this presentation are to explain the purpose and requirements of the transition plan, how to create a transition plan using the provided template, and the context, rationale, and resources for each action item of the transition plan. House Bill 1605 88th Regular Session 2023 was enacted in June 2023. The bill had impacts on several areas related to instructional materials, parent transparency, TEKS review and revision, as well as teacher protections. Today's presentation will focus on the OER Instructional Material Transition Plan that is required to qualify for the additional $20 entitlement for printing of state-developed materials, approved by the State Board of Education in the new Instructional Material and Review process. A transition plan is not required to access the initial $40 entitlement for State Board of Education approved materials. I would like to direct your attention to the House Bill 1605 landing page that the agency has developed. We have set up this website to support stakeholders in getting information on the implementation of this legislation. Supports include summaries of State Board of Education meetings where House Bill 1605 implementation was discussed, a collection of our informational webinars, frequently asked questions and answers, along with the timeline of implementation for key components of the bill. To access this page, you can either scan the QR code on the screen or visit tea.texas.gov/academics/instructional-materials/House-Bill-1605. Since the enactment of House Bill 1605, the State Board of Education and the Texas Education Agency have been implementing the inaugural Instructional Materials Review and Approval process. This process is an annual process, and the first review is titled Cycle 2024. In November 2023, the agency issued a request for materials. In March 2024, the agency announced a list of materials to be reviewed. 142 products were reviewed in IMRA Cycle 2024. In September 2024, the State Board of Education reviewed IMRA reports and public hearing on materials. In November 2024, the State Board of Education voted to approve, reject, or take no action on submitted materials. Following that vote, funding that was part of House Bill 1605 for instructional materials was made available so that school districts and open enrollment charter schools may requisition new materials in the educational materials system called EMAT for implementation in the 2025-26 school year. An OER Instructional Material Transition Plan is required to qualify for the additional state aid of $20 per student for State Board of Education approved OER instructional materials under Chapter 48, Section 308 of the Texas Education Code. For clarity purposes, we will provide alignment on 4 instructional materials terms. Instructional materials are any materials used to convey the essential knowledge and skills of a subject, including but not limited to lesson plans, textbooks, student materials, and online learning supports. State Board of Education approved instructional materials are any instructional materials that have been through the IMRA process and have been officially approved by the State Board of Education. These materials are considered high-quality instructional materials, or HQIM. Open education resources, or OER, are materials that reside in the public domain or have been released under an intellectual property license that allows for free use, reuse, modification, and sharing with others. State-developed OER are any instructional materials created by the Texas Education Agency. State-developed instructional materials are considered open education resources. The only state-developed OER instructional material that currently exists is Bluebonnet Learning. There are many ways in which districts can fund instructional material purchases. Let's review a couple of instructional materials funding options. The State Instructional Materials and Technology Fund is a reserve of capital comprised of an amount set aside by the State Board of Education from the available school fund and any amounts lawfully paid into the fund from any other source and appropriated by the legislature. Money from the fund finances the instructional materials and technology allotment. This fund has also been referred to by former names, including the Instructional Materials Fund, IMF, or the Textbook Fund. The Instructional Materials and Technology Allotment, or IMTA, is a biennial allotment of money from the State Instructional Materials and Technology Fund to Texas Public Schools. This has been referred to as the Technology Instructional Materials Allotment, or TIMA, in past legislation. The State Board of Education approved Instructional Materials Entitlement is an annual additional entitlement of $40 per enrolled student credited to a district's instructional materials and technology account to procure instructional materials placed on the approved list maintained by the State Board of Education through the IMRA process under Texas Education Code, Chapter 31, Section 22, and Texas Education Code, Chapter 48, Section 307. The state-developed Open Education Resource Entitlement is an annual additional entitlement of up to $20 per enrolled student credited to a district's instructional materials and technology account for expenses incurred in the printing and shipping of State Board of Education approved OER instructional materials under Texas Education Code, Chapter 48, Section 308. The state-developed Open Education Resource Entitlement is the most relevant instructional materials funding stream for the purpose of this presentation. Transition Plan Overview. In this section of the presentation, we will provide an overview of the requirements of the Open Education Resource Instructional Material Transition Plan. This presentation focuses on the requirements related to the state-developed Open Education Resources Entitlement. Development of a transition plan is required to access the state-developed Open Education Resource Entitlement funds and applies only to school districts and open enrollment charter schools implementing Bluebonnet Learning instructional materials. OER Entitlement Qualifications. For a school district or open enrollment charter school to qualify for the state-developed OER entitlement for additional instructional materials procurement funding, the school district's Board of Trustees must adopt an OER instructional material transition plan. An OER instructional material transition plan is required when initially adopting the State Board of Education approved instructional materials for any grade level or subject or course, or when expanding implementation of State Board of Education approved instructional materials to additional campuses and/or grade levels. Strong Foundations Implementation Exception. Any school district or open enrollment charter school participating in Strong Foundations implementation for Bluebonnet Learning is not required to adopt an OER instructional material transition plan. Please note that current or prior participation in Strong Foundations implementation or other Texas Education Agency instructional materials and implementation grant programs, such as Texas Home Learning, CRIMSI, or T-Class, does not qualify for the exception. OER Transition Plan Approval and Submission. OER instructional material transition plans are adopted by the local Board of Trustees prior to the start of the academic school year. They are locally maintained by the school district or open enrollment charter school. The adopted plan will not need to be submitted. However, plans could be requested for review by the commissioner, upon which the commissioner will communicate the submission process. School districts and open enrollment charter schools will report completion of the transition plan through EMAT. The transition plan required components are outlined in Texas Administrative Code, Chapter 67, Subchapter CC, Commissioner's Rules concerning open education instructional materials, and include planning for clear communication and stakeholder change management planning, timely access to print materials and related manipulatives through procurement and distribution, sufficient planning and instructional time evidenced by instructional calendars and master schedules aligned to the requirements of the materials, clear expectations for the implementation of the materials, protocols, and assessments, processes for stakeholder communication and public posting as outlined in Texas Education Code, Chapter 26, Section 6, if materials have been modified, maintenance of instructional flexibility through clear guidance for acceptable teacher modifications to instructional pacing, sequencing, and lesson content to address the needs of each student, and sufficient professional learning and development for school leaders, instructional coaches, and teachers, including pre-service product onboarding and orientation, and ongoing job-embedded, curriculum-based professional learning, including cycles of observation and feedback. A copy of the Commissioner's Rules is included in the appendix of the accompanying presentation to this webinar. Transition Plan Template. In this section of the presentation, we will explain the design of the OER Transition Plan for Bluebonnet Learning Instructional Materials Template and provide guidance with additional context and examples for each section of the template. The transition plan is designed to support the effective implementation of Bluebonnet Learning instructional materials. The template complies with all requirements outlined in the Commissioner's Rules for Texas Administrative Code, Chapter 67, Section 1315, Open Education Resource Instructional Materials Transition Plan. The action items and planning components are based on best practices to support the effective implementation of Bluebonnet Learning. Each action item features one or more additional resources, examples, or reference materials to support strategic planning efforts. The transition plan template is organized into 5 action planning sections. Action 1 focuses on action items related to setting implementation goals. Action 2, creating the conditions for success, supports putting enabling conditions in place. Action 3, plans for structures to support leading internalization and professional learning communities. Action 4 supports establishing observation and feedback practices. And Action 5, aligning assessment strategy, focuses on prioritizing curriculum embedded assessments. Transition Plan Template Guidance. The OER Transition Plan for Bluebonnet Learning instructional materials includes a guidance and resources to support the development of a strong and effective implementation plan. This guidance includes action items that provide specific actions and next steps, key questions to consider that support strategic thinking and planning efforts, and resources including implementation information, planning guidance, examples, templates, and tools to support the development of the plan, as well as the execution and monitoring of the transition plan. Before your team gets started on the transition plan, it is highly recommended to review the following resources. Watch this presentation, the webinar, in its entirety. Download and view a PDF copy of the webinar slides. review the Crofton ISD sample transition plan, understand how to access certain Bluebonnet Learning documents, and learn about the Bluebonnet Learning pre-launch phase. All of these resources can be found in the first 2 pages of the OER transition plan for Bluebonnet Learning instructional materials template. Action 1, setting implementation goals. There are 2 action items included in this section. Action 1A, implementation framework, includes the review of 2 resources, the implementation framework and the fidelity of implementation look-fors, to identify the phase of implementation and to become familiar with key actions to support successful implementation efforts. Implementation of Bluebonnet Learning is a multifaceted change management process that progresses over time through phases. The 4 phases include adoption, pre-launch, initial implementation, and deeper implementation. The question that leaders are contemplating at each phase changes. At the adoption phase, leaders are asking, which instructional materials will best support our school district or open enrollment charter school to realize our vision and goals for student learning? If you have already selected Bluebonnet Learning as the instructional material for the upcoming school year, you have moved into the pre-launch phase, where the question now shifts to how do we create the conditions for successful implementation of the materials selected and invest all stakeholders. Many elements in the transition plan are designed to support pre-launch components. Once implementation begins, the focus moves to initial and then deeper implementation. At the initial implementation phase, the question is focused on how do we support teachers in effectively internalizing and implementing the materials consistently? And at the deeper implementation phase, leaders are thinking about how they will strengthen implementation of the materials and empower teachers to use data to consistently support all learners in accessing grade-level content. Once pre-launch conditions are established and the school year is launching, school districts or open enrollment charter schools will begin implementation at either the initial or deeper phase of implementation. By identifying the appropriate phase of implementation for the start of the upcoming school year, leaders will be able to use the implementation framework and the fidelity of implementation look-fors resources to guide the selection of attainable implementation goals. A district adopting Bluebonnet Learning without previous experience with high-quality or OER instructional materials, or one who is not familiar with using internalization protocols, would be at the initial phase of implementation. However, a district that has been using TEA's internalization and student work analysis protocols and may have experience with other versions of an OER and have effective systems in place for several years now, might be more aligned to the focus areas that are outlined in deeper implementation. The implementation framework is included in the resource section of this action item and outlines the essential tasks and actions by role for district leader, school leader, instructional coach, and teacher for 3 of the phases: pre-launch, initial implementation, and deeper implementation. Action 1B, implementation goals. Meaningful goals provide focus, clarity, and motivation to stakeholders involved in the work of Bluebonnet Learning implementation. This action item develop a specific goal and progress monitoring timeline for each implementation goal area: Bluebonnet Learning implementation, stakeholder investment, teacher practice, and student outcomes, is based on the implementation phase identified in action step 1A, as well as any local context. Effective goals that will support implementation of Bluebonnet Learning are compelling and inspiring, yet specific and realistic. They are connected to the vision and core beliefs They are aligned with the appropriate phase of implementation. They are clear and they are communicated to all stakeholders, and they are continuously monitored, reflected upon, and adjusted. Review the resources provided in the template for an example of implementation goals from Crofton ISD, a sample district at the initial phase of implementation. There are 5 action items included in Action 2, creating the conditions for success. 2A, materials access. This action item focuses on the development of a plan for timely access to print materials and related manipulatives through Bluebonnet Learning procurement and distribution. Ensuring all teachers, including general education and specialized teachers, instructional coaches, and school leaders, have access to the necessary materials is an essential technical condition that must be in place for teachers to implement Bluebonnet Learning instructional materials effectively and with fidelity. Technical conditions refer to the defined systems, structures, and procedures that must be in place to support implementation. In the transition plan, this action item outlines 7 steps necessary to support an efficient and effective procurement and distribution process. Action 2B, schedules and calendars. It is important that master schedules and instructional calendars be designed to provide the required instructional minutes and adequate time for teacher planning during the regular workday. This action item designed master schedules and instructional calendars to meet the required instructional minutes as outlined in Bluebonnet Learning and ensure time for teacher planning and lesson preparation is provided within the normal teacher workday is an essential part of pre-launch planning. Crofton ISD knew that time for teacher planning and classroom instruction were critical technical conditions that must be in place to support effective implementation. The Crofton team studied the Bluebonnet Learning implementation guides to create instructional minute requirements for reading language arts and mathematics classroom instruction. They established guidelines for both general and specialized education teachers to receive a minimum of 75 minutes of collaborative planning time each week, in addition to the allotted individual teacher planning and preparation time. Action 2C, aligned expectations. Develop and communicate clear expectations for the use of Bluebonnet Learning instructional materials with fidelity. To support fidelity of implementation, alignment of clear expectations for all stakeholders is necessary for the use of instructional materials, internalization in student work analysis protocols, and curriculum embedded assessments. A best practice recommendation is to use Bluebonnet Learning instructional materials, the supporting frameworks, the protocols, the embedded resources as they were designed. However, specific expectations for implementation will vary across school systems based on your local context and your phase of implementation. Using the Fidelity of Implementation Look-For's resource, our sample district, Crofton ISD, created aligned expectations to support implementation. For use of the materials, they determined that Bluebonnet Learning materials are used for daily Tier 1 instruction for all students without substituting or supplementing with other materials not approved for use. Teachers would prioritize internalization during common planning time. They would use Bluebonnet Learning protocols and annotate their lessons in a way that demonstrates alignment to the protocols. Teachers, coaches, and leaders would analyze student work using the Bluebonnet Learning protocol during common planning time at least once per month, beginning in October. And teachers would consistently administer Bluebonnet Learning embedded assessments. In Action 2B, a professional learning plan for teachers, instructional coaches, and school leaders is developed that includes product onboarding and orientation and ongoing job-embedded, curriculum-based professional development. Intentional professional learning experiences are necessary and essential to support teachers, coaches, and leaders in the effective implementation of Bluebonnet Learning. Important professional learning experiences that support effective implementation include training on the RBs, on the research-based instructional strategies, understanding of the implementation goals, clarity around expectations, and clear processes, onboarding and orientation to the Bluebonnet learning materials, training around the Bluebonnet learning design principles, having opportunities for collaborative internalization and student work analysis, regular observation and feedback cycles, and other ongoing job-embedded curriculum-based professional learning opportunities. Action 2E, adaptive change and communication. This action item includes the development of a communication plan that will support adaptive change management and ensure stakeholder understanding and commitment to the purpose of adopting and implementing Bluebonnet learning, including stakeholder communication and public posting if any aspect of the materials is modified as outlined in Texas Education Code, Chapter 36, Section 6. This task is a high-impact action item. Effective communication and change management impact the success of instructional materials implementation. Attending to adaptive change management involves preparing staff to accept, understand, adjust to, and embrace a change. Ensuring stakeholder understanding and commitment to the purpose for implementation of Bluebonnet learning is essential, as providing clarity, investing stakeholders, and motivating leaders will support adaptive change. The resources provided in Action Item 2E feature strategies to support managing change and adaptive challenges that may arise. Additionally, strategies that focus on regular and routine communication, celebrating successes, and opportunities for teachers and other stakeholders to ask questions in a safe environment support positive change management. The resource, Reflective Questions and Strategies for Adaptive Change, included in the template, offers several strategy ideas that support implementation and change management efforts. There are 3 action items included in Action 3, Leading Internalization and Professional Learning Communities. Action 3A, Analyzing PLC Practices. Analyze the current state of professional learning communities or teacher planning and preparation practices to prioritize high-impact changes and next steps. Classroom instruction and student outcomes improve when teachers have a consistent, meaningful time to collaborate and deeply understand the material they are teaching. Collaborative planning opportunities include unit internalization, lesson internalization, and student work analysis. One resource provided in the template is the core characteristics of effective PLCs. When conducting current state analyses of PLCs, leaders are encouraged to measure the extent that planning environments meet these characteristics of safe, collaborative, relevant, and positive. Action 3B, Structures for Internalization. Develop structures and systems to support internalization practices that include a vision, roles and responsibilities, and technical conditions needed. Internalization is the process of deeply studying a Bluebonnet learning unit or lesson to understand what students are expected to learn and how to teach the content to achieve those outcomes. The process of internalization includes 3 key steps. First, educators backwards plan by starting with the end in mind to understand the goals of the unit and lesson. Next, they do the critical work of students by reading texts, answering questions, or completing mathematical tasks to understand what exactly is expected of the students. Then, they plan, prepare, and use the intentional curriculum-embedded supports to support all student needs while still maintaining the rigor and integrity of the grade level content. Several resources are included in Action Item 3B, including an example of an internalization vision, roles, and structures, and a handout that explains the differences between internalization and more traditional lesson design. Action 3C, develop and communicate clear guidelines for supporting all learners and maintaining instructional flexibility that outlines acceptable teacher modifications to address the needs of each student. In order to support all learners and to meet the needs of all students, instructional material and classroom delivery adjustments may have to be made. Establishing guidelines for supporting all learners provides clear expectations for teachers, instructional coaches, and school leaders in the areas of Bluebonnet Learning embedded supports, engagement strategies, and instructional flexibility. Our sample district, Crofton ISD, set some guidelines to support all learners before the start of the school year. Some of the guidelines they set included: 1, teachers will identify which embedded supports will be used during instruction when they're internalizing their lessons. 2, teachers will annotate in their materials which engagement strategies will be used during instruction. And 3, teachers have the flexibility within the scope and sequence to make adjustments of 5 instructional days so they can adjust pacing as needed to address the needs of each student. There are 2 action items included in Action 4, establishing observation and feedback practices. Action 4A, observation expectations. Develop expectations for observing Bluebonnet Learning implementation. All stakeholders must clearly understand the purpose and process of observing Bluebonnet Learning instruction. 3 key factors to consider when planning observation expectations include: 1, high fidelity of implementation is positively correlated with an increased frequency of classroom observations. 2, when observing instruction, look beyond the surface for evidence that the teacher has internalized the lesson or unit. And 3, observe instruction alongside the materials. Observers must be familiar with the lesson's intended objective, key texts and tasks, and daily exit ticket or formative assessment. In Action 4B, observation and feedback cycles, a plan is developed that supports professional learning and development for school leaders, instructional coaches, and teachers through observation and feedback cycles. Conducting frequent observation and feedback cycles provides educators with high-impact opportunities for ongoing job-embedded professional learning. Key actions to plan and execute during the pre-launch and early implementation phases include: train school leaders and instructional coaches on the observation tools, including opportunities for calibration and norming. Provide ample practice opportunities with the observation tools. Implement a coaching model. Define a process for how feedback will be delivered. And use action step tools and/or routines, such as the Strong Foundations Implementation Action Step Guides, which are included in the resources section of this action item. And they feature a process for giving feedback to teachers following an observation with concrete next steps that improve teacher practice and fidelity of implementation. Action 5. There are 2 action items included in aligning assessment strategy. Action 5A. Analyzing assessment practices features a current state analysis of assessment practices to prioritize high-impact changes and next steps. Conducting a current state analysis provides the opportunity for intensive review and reflection on what aspects of assessments are successful and what areas need improvement. A key part of a current state analysis is to determine adjustments that might need to be made to prioritize the Bluebonnet Learning embedded assessments. When implemented successfully, curriculum-embedded assessments provide teachers with an understanding of the degree that students are building the knowledge and skills taught throughout the unit, while also providing insights on additional support that students might need in future units and lessons. The keys to success for an aligned assessment strategy include these elements: developing an assessment vision, ensuring protected time and determining the frequency of assessments, setting guidelines for assessment integrity, strategically integrating other assessments, and regular analysis of student work and assessment data. The assessment keys to success included in the resources section of this action item provides a list of criteria that can be used to conduct the current state analysis. This resource also features a sample vision for assessment, time and frequency considerations, and examples of practices that can support or hinder assessment integrity. The task for Action 5B, Structures for Assessment Practices, is to develop and communicate expectations that prioritize curriculum-embedded assessments and student work analysis. It is essential to prioritize curriculum-embedded assessments because gathering and analyzing data from embedded assessments helps teachers understand students' thinking, identify strengths and progress toward mastery, and determine gaps in skills and knowledge. Defining assessment and student work analysis expectations ensures that assessments and student work collected are used in meaningful ways. Bluebonnet learning assessments are connected to what has been taught in a unit or lesson, and they provide teachers with meaningful and actionable data. The assessment keys to success in the resources section of this action item includes recommendations for the use of other assessments, practices to support data analysis, and high-impact strategies to support effective assessment practices. Thank you for engaging in this presentation on the OER transition plan for Bluebonnet Learning. If you have questions, please submit those questions to our Instructional Materials Implementation Help Desk. Links and other helpful resources are located in the OER transition plan for Bluebonnet Learning template and in the appendix of this presentation. Thank you.